All right, so you want to go deeper on James 4:13 to 17.
Yeah.
You know the verses.
Mm-hmm.
You've probably even preached on them.
Great.
But you're looking for something more,
Yeah.
something that'll really make your congregation stop and think.
Absolutely.
And that's what this deep dive is all about.
That's right.
We've been analyzing sermons and interpretations from churches across the country,
Yep.
looking for those fresh angles and illustrations that go beyond the obvious.
That stuff that makes you go, I never thought of it like that before.
So no Christian platitudes here.
Nope.
We're getting into the nitty-gritty of how different pastors are approaching this passage
Right.
in unique and memorable ways.
That's what we're here for.
What's the first thing that jumped out at you?
Well, the first thing that struck me was the sheer variety of interpretations.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it seems like almost every sermon we looked at had a different central theme.
Like what?
Humility, generosity, trusting in God's plan.
Okay.
It's almost like James 4:13 to 17 is this multifaceted jewel.
Reflecting a different truth depending on which way you turn it.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
But how do you actually turn those different facets into a compelling sermon?
That's the question, isn't it?
Give me an example.
Well, take Hope Midtown Church.
Okay.
Their sermon series was called Living Generously.
Yeah.
And they actually tied James 4:13 to 17 to the whole YOLO culture.
Wait, YOLO?
Yeah.
You only live once.
That's the one.
Isn't that a bit risky, using a phrase like that from the pulpit?
It might be for some.
Could it alienate some members of the congregation?
Well, you got to know your audience, right?
I guess so.
But risk can be a good thing sometimes,
Oh.
especially if it grabs people's attention.
And gets them talking.
And that's exactly what Hope Midtown did.
Okay, so how did they use it?
They used YOLO as a jumping off point to talk about our culture's obsession with the here and now. They argued that James is calling us to something deeper, to live with an eternal perspective.
Instead of just focusing on the immediate gratification. Right, not squeezing every last drop of pleasure out of this life.
But aligning our lives with God's will.
Even when it comes to something as practical as our finances.
Okay, I see what they did there.
Yeah.
It's kind of a clever twist,
Uh-huh.
using that secular idea to actually underscore a spiritual truth.
You gotta meet people where they are, right?
I guess you do.
Did they give any specific examples?
Yeah, of what that kind of eternal perspective generosity would look like.
That's what's so interesting about this deep dive.
What is it?
We're seeing a real emphasis on moving beyond vague platitudes.
Okay.
And actually giving people concrete ways to apply these verses to their lives.
So what kind of actionable insights are we seeing?
Well, FBC of El Campo had a really helpful list from John MacArthur about how to actually discern God's will.
So practical steps.
Yeah, they focused on being saved, living differently from the world, having a life of thanksgiving, obtaining wisdom from God's word, and testifying to God's work in your life.
It's like a checklist for aligning your life with God's plan.
It is, yeah.
Not just saying the words, but actually walking the walk.
That's what matters.
Now, another thing that struck me as we were going through these sermons was the recurring use of visual imagery.
Yeah, visuals can be so powerful, can't they?
Especially around the idea of life being fleeting.
It's true.
We saw a lot of mist, vapor, even breath being used to describe how short our time on earth really is.
It really drives home the point, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Access Church, for example, used a really striking visual to illustrate this point.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Imagine a long rope stretched across the stage.
Yeah.
And only a tiny section of it is colored red.
Okay.
That red section represents our time on Earth.
Wow.
Compared to the vastness of eternity.
I'm trying to picture this rope analogy.
Yeah, it was pretty impressive.
Did they actually use a really long rope?
They did. It was impressive.
And how do they make it work visually?
It was pretty amazing.
Okay.
And it really drove home the point that our earthly concerns are pretty insignificant in the grand scheme of things.
Which is exactly what James is getting at.
Right.
Don't get so caught up in your plans that you forget what truly matters.
Keep your eyes on the prize, so to speak.
It's kind of a gut punch when you see it like that.
It is, yeah.
Suddenly all those anxieties and deadlines just seem to fade away.
Puts things in perspective.
Makes you realize that there's a bigger story going on here.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to another key theme that emerged from these sermons.
Oh, what's that?
Moving beyond that surface level understanding of if God wills.
Yeah, we saw a lot of that.
You know, just tacking it onto our plans without really grappling with what it means.
It's easy to do, isn't it?
Right. It's so easy to just say God willing without really surrendering to his will.
Like it's just a habit.
It becomes almost like a superstitious phrase
Yeah,
instead of a genuine expression of faith.
exactly. And that's where it gets dangerous.
How so?
We end up disguising our own desires as God's will, praying, God, please make this happen, when what we really mean is, God, please bless my plan.
It's like we're trying to fit God into our plans
Yeah.
instead of fitting our plans into His.
You got it.
And that's a subtle but crucial distinction.
It is? Yeah.
One church, Central Baptist Church, Dunn, North Carolina, really hammered this point home.
Okay.
They emphasized that true surrender means being willing to let go of our own agenda,
That's tough.
even if it means our plans don't work out the way we want them to,
It's a hard pill to swallow sometimes.
which is a tough pill to swallow,
Yeah.
especially for us pastors.
Yeah, we like to be in control.
We like to be in control, to have things planned out.
It's in our nature.
It is?
But that's what makes James 4:13-17 so relevant,
Yeah.
even centuries later.
Still speaks to us today.
It's a reminder that we're not in control, and honestly, that's okay.
In fact, it can be incredibly freeing
They can, yeah.
to admit that we don't have all the answers,
To let go of the illusion of control.
to let go of that illusion of control and surrender to God's wisdom.
And that's a message that every congregation, every believer needs to hear.
Absolutely.
It's not about becoming passive.
Or giving up on our dreams.
It's about aligning our desires with God's will, trusting that He knows what's best for us.
Which can be a scary proposition,
Can be, yeah.
because it means we have to be open to the possibility that God might have a different plan for us
Than the one we've mapped out.
than the one we've mapped out.
Absolutely.
But it's also an incredibly exciting proposition,
How so?
because it means that our lives can be part of something much bigger than ourselves.
That's a great way to put it.
And that's a message that I think can resonate with anyone,
Yeah.
not just pastors.
It's a universal truth.
It's a reminder that
Mhm.
we're all part of God's story and that He has a plan for each of us.
And that's something to hold on to.
And one of the things that these sermons really highlighted
What was that?
was the importance of storytelling
Ah.
as a way to bring this message to life.
Storytelling is powerful.
A good story can make even the most familiar verses feel fresh and relevant.
It's true.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
A good story can stick with you long after the sermon is over.
It gets in your bones.
It can help you to really internalize the message and see how it applies to your own life.
And who doesn't love a good story?
One story that really stood out to me
Okay, tell me about it.
came from Central Baptist Church, Dunn, North Carolina.
Okay.
It's about a golfer who's having a terrible day on the course.
Oh, I think I remember this one.
He's slicing his shots, missing his putts, and generally feeling frustrated.
Sounds familiar.
So relatable.
Isn't it, though?
Right.
Yeah.
And just when he's about to give up,
Okay.
he hears a voice booming from heaven
Wait, what?
saying, use the 8-iron.
No way!
Wait, hold on.
Okay.
A voice from heaven.
Yeah.
Did he think he was losing his mind?
Well, I'd be questioning things.
Well, of course he's a little startled.
Right.
But he figures, hey, why not?
What's he got to lose at this point?
If God's giving him golf advice, he might as well take it.
Right.
So he grabs his 8-iron, takes a swing, and completely shanks the ball. Goes flying off into the woods.
That's rough.
Oh,
So much for divine intervention.
so much for divine intervention.
What happened next?
He's furious.
I bet.
He yells up to heaven, hey, you told me to use the 8-iron.
Oh, man.
I could just imagine him shaking his fist at the clouds.
I can picture it.
So what does God say?
I'm on the edge of my seat here.
The voice calmly replies, from where?
Oh, I love that.
It's funny, but it also makes a brilliant point.
It does, yeah.
We often want God to give us very specific instructions,
We want the cheat codes.
but sometimes we forget to consider the context, the bigger picture.
You don't see the whole board.
We're asking for the right club without understanding the lay of the land.
We're just swinging blindly.
Or, in this case, the where we're standing in God's plan.
Yeah, that's good.
It's a great example of how humor can be used to illustrate a serious point.
It's a good way to get people's attention.
And it's something that we saw a lot of in these sermons.
What was that?
Pastors are using humor,
Uh-huh.
personal anecdotes,
Yeah.
even pop culture references
To keep things interesting.
to make these verses come alive for their congregations.
And it works.
Because at the end of the day, people remember stories.
They do.
They remember those moments that made them laugh, made them think, made them feel something.
That's what makes a sermon memorable.
And that's what makes a sermon truly impactful.
It's about connecting with people on a deeper level.
Speaking of stories, there was another one that really resonated with me.
Okay. What was that one?
It was from Life Community Church,
Okay.
and it involved a farmer.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
Do you remember that one?
I do, yeah.
Yes.
It was a good one.
This farmer works tirelessly to clear his land, plant his crops,
Right.
and build a successful farm.
A self-made man.
He's proud of his accomplishments,
Yeah.
and rightly so.
He's earned it.
He's put in the sweat and toil.
Blood, sweat, and tears.
But there's a problem.
What's that?
He's forgotten where it all came from.
Uh-oh.
The land,
Right.
the strength to work it,
Yeah.
the rain that waters the crops, the very breath in his lungs.
He's forgotten the source. He's taken it all for granted.
He's become so focused on his own efforts
Yeah.
that he's completely overlooking the fact that it was God who gave him the strength, the resources, and the opportunity to do it all.
He's lost sight of the bigger picture.
It's that classic tale of forgetting the source of our blessings.
It is.
And it's a cautionary tale for all of us, not just farmers.
For all of us, yeah.
It is.
Because that kind of self-sufficiency can lead to pride
Yeah.
and a sense of entitlement.
Right.
And that's the opposite of what James is calling us to.
So what is he calling us to?
He's calling us to humility,
Okay.
to recognize that everything we have is a gift from God.
And that changes everything, doesn't it?
It really does.
It changes the way we view our work, our possessions, our relationship,
Our whole perspective shifts.
even our plans for the future.
It affects everything.
It does.
It shifts our perspective from what can I achieve to what can God do through me.
And that's a powerful shift.
It is.
A shift that can transform not just our sermons,
But our lives.
but our lives.
Absolutely. You know those stories we were just talking about, the golfer and the farmer?
Yeah.
They really highlight something interesting about human nature.
What's that?
We love to overcomplicate things.
Oh, tell me about it.
It's like we want a step-by-step guide from God,
Yeah.
a detailed itinerary for our lives.
And when we don't get that,
Right.
we try to force it.
Mm-hmm.
We come up with these elaborate plans,
Right.
these 5-year projections,
Yeah.
as if we could somehow predict and control the future.
Like we're in charge.
Right.
And that's where that whole Mr. Vapor analogy comes back in.
Okay.
It's a stark reminder of just how fleeting our existence really is.
It really is.
We get so caught up in planning for tomorrow that we forget how quickly it can all vanish.
It's like
Yeah.
trying to write a novel in a disappearing scroll.
Exactly.
And yet, James isn't saying we shouldn't plan at all.
No, he's not.
He's not calling us to just sit back and let life happen to us.
He's not saying be passive.
He's challenging us to hold our plans loosely
Right.
with a humble awareness of God's sovereignty.
So it's a balance.
So it's about finding that balance
Yeah.
between action and surrender.
We're not puppets.
We're called to be responsible stewards of the gifts God has given us,
Absolutely.
but also to recognize that ultimately, He's the one in control.
He's the one calling the shots.
And I think that's a message that resonates deeply with pastors and church leaders.
I agree.
We're often the ones people turn to for answers,
Yeah.
for guidance.
They look to us for direction.
But we have to be careful not to present ourselves as having it all figured out,
Oh, for sure.
because we don't.
No.
They're just as human as anyone else,
just as flawed.
just as prone to making plans without consulting God,
It's a constant temptation.
which is probably why this passage is so humbling.
It is, yeah.
It's a reminder that even in our ministry, we need to be walking in step with the Spirit,
Mm-hmm.
seeking God's will above our own.
That's the key.
And one of the practical takeaways we saw in these sermons
What's that?
was the emphasis on daily surrender.
Oh.
Not a one-time decision,
Not a one and done.
checking the God-willing box and moving on.
No, it's a daily thing.
It's an ongoing process,
a way of life.
a daily choice to lay down our own agenda
Yeah.
and say, God, what do you want me to do today? How
Right.
can I be a vessel for your purposes?
Asking those questions every day.
Exactly.
And Central Baptist Church, Dunn, North Carolina, had a great illustration of this.
Okay.
They talked about how in the military, soldiers have to constantly recalibrate their compasses
To stay on course.
to make sure they're still heading in the right direction.
Because even a slight deviation can lead you miles off course.
That's true.
Right.
And it's the same with our spiritual lives.
Okay.
We need to be constantly checking in with God,
Realigning our hearts.
realigning our hearts with His will.
To make sure we're still on the path He's called us to.
Otherwise, we get lost.
Otherwise, we end up like that golfer
Yeah.
taking a swing with the wrong club,
Out in the woods somewhere.
wondering why we're not getting the results we expected.
It's a great analogy, isn't it?
It is.
Because it highlights that we can have the right tools, the right intentions,
Mm-hmm.
but if we're not aligned with God's will,
Yeah.
we're going to end up lost and frustrated.
And speaking of analogies,
Okay.
I keep thinking about how James might speak to a modern audience.
That's a good question.
What kind of illustrations would he use if he were preaching today?
That's a fascinating question.
I mean, he was speaking to merchants back then.
Yeah.
People obsessed with business plans and profits.
Always looking for the next deal.
Yeah. What are our modern-day equivalents?
What would grab people's attention today?
Well, we're definitely a culture obsessed with planning and control.
That's for sure.
We've got our calendars, our to-do lists, our 5-year plans,
Our spreadsheets.
our color-coded spreadsheet.
And don't forget social media.
Oh, yeah.
We're constantly curating our online presence.
Trying to project a certain image.
Trying to project an image of success and control.
It's like we're all building these perfectly manicured digital sandcastles.
Which can be swept away in an instant.
Which can be swept away in an instant by an algorithm change or a viral tweet.
Exactly.
So maybe James would use the analogy of a social media feed.
Oh, that's good.
To illustrate the fleeting nature of our plans.
Yeah.
You spend all this time crafting the perfect image.
The perfect post.
But it's ultimately ephemeral.
Here today, gone tomorrow.
It can disappear in a blink.
Or maybe he'd talk about the stock market.
Ooh, that's a good one.
People invest so much time and energy trying to predict the future, but it's ultimately a gamble.
A roll of the dice.
Ooh, I like that one.
It speaks to our obsession with control.
Right.
With trying to manipulate outcomes that are ultimately outside of our grasp.
We think we're pulling the strings, but we're not.
Or how about something as simple as a smartphone?
Okay.
We rely on these devices for everything.
We're addicted to them.
But what happens when the battery dies or the signal drops?
Oh.
Suddenly, we're cut off.
Yeah.
Disconnected from all those carefully laid plans.
It throws everything into chaos.
Those are all such great examples.
They are.
It just goes to show that the message of James 4:13-17 is timeless.
It's a universal truth.
It's as relevant today as it was centuries ago.
Human nature hasn't changed much.
Because at the end of the day, we're all just mist.
Here for a little while.
Here for a little while and then gone.
And that's why it's so important to make our lives count.
To live with purpose.
To live in a way that honors God and fulfills his purposes.
But how do we do that in a practical way?
That's the question, isn't it?
How do we move beyond the platitudes and actually live out this message of surrender and trust?
It's not always easy.
Well, one thing that several of these sermons emphasized was the importance of understanding the context of James 4:13-17.
Yeah.
It's not just a random collection of verses.
They're not just floating out.
There's part of a larger argument that James is making.
So what's the bigger picture?
So what is that argument?
Yeah.
What's the bigger picture here?
Well, if you back up a few verses,
Okay.
you see that James is talking about boasting, about arrogance.
Thinking too highly of ourselves.
He's calling out those who are making plans without any regard for God's will.
They're going their own way.
And he's specifically addressing merchants.
Okay.
Who were notorious for their self-reliance.
They thought they could do it all themselves.
And their obsession with profit.
It was all about the bottom line.
So he's not just talking about making plans in general.
Okay.
He's talking about making plans that are driven by pride, by greed,
by selfish ambition,
by a desire to control.
So it's not about the plans themselves.
No.
It's about the motivation behind them.
Exactly.
And that's an important distinction.
It is, yeah.
Because it helps us to understand the heart of the matter.
It's about getting to the root of the issue.
It's not about avoiding plans altogether.
No, not at all.
It's about aligning our motives with God's will.
Making sure our hearts are in the right place.
So it's not just about what we're doing.
Right.
But why we're doing it.
The why is just as important as the what.
Our plans can be good and noble.
On the surface.
But if they're ultimately driven by selfish ambition, they're going to miss the mark.
They'll be off target.
And that's where humility comes in.
Ah, yes, humility.
It's about recognizing that we're not the masters of our own destiny.
We're not in control.
That our lives are ultimately in God's hands.
And that can be a hard thing to accept.
And that can be a really tough thing to admit.
It goes against our nature.
Especially for those of us who are used to being in charge.
Yeah, right.
Pastors, business leaders, even parents.
We like to call the shots.
It is.
But it's also incredibly freeing.
Oh, so.
Because it takes the pressure off of us to have all the answers.
To figure it all out.
To orchestrate every detail of our lives.
It allows us to let go of that illusion of control.
Yeah.
And surrender to God's will.
Which is perfect.
Which is always good, always perfect, always on time.
And that's the beautiful paradox of James 4:13-17.
What is it?
It's in surrendering our control that we find true freedom.
It's counterintuitive.
It's in letting go of our own plans that we discover God's best for our lives.
It's a message that goes against our natural instincts,
It does.
but it's a message that we desperately need to hear.
A message for the ages.
And it's a message that I think can resonate with people from all walks of life.
It's a universal truth.
Not just those who are familiar with the Bible,
It speaks to the human condition.
because we all crave certainty.
We want to know what's going to happen.
We all want to know what the future holds.
We want to feel secure.
But the truth is, none of us do.
Nope.
And that's okay.
It's part of the adventure.
In fact, it's in that uncertainty, in that surrender,
Right.
that we find true peace.
And that's a message that's worth preaching.
It is. It really is a powerful message. And it makes me wonder, how can we as pastors and Bible study leaders make this message of surrender and trust come alive for our congregations? How do we help them to really grasp the depth of what James is saying here?
Well, I think it starts with helping them to see the relevance of this passage to their own lives. We've talked a lot about merchants and social media, but the truth is this message applies to anyone who's ever felt the weight of uncertainty, the pressure to control, the temptation to put their own plans ahead of God's subs.
Which is basically everyone, right? I mean, who hasn't struggled with those things at some point in their lives?
Exactly. So I think one of the most important things we can do is to create space for people to share their own stories, to talk about the times they've tried to force their own plans, the times they felt anxious about the future, the times they've wished they could just hand it all over to God.
Because when we hear other people's stories, it helps us to realize that we're not alone in our struggles.
Right. It normalizes the experience of doubt and uncertainty. And it creates a sense of community, a shared journey of faith.
And I think that's where the real power of James 4:13-17 lies. It's not just about individual surrender. It's about surrendering together as a community of believers, trusting that God has a plan for all of us.
And that's a message that can be incredibly comforting, especially in a world that feels increasingly chaotic and unpredictable.
You know, we've talked about a lot of different sermon illustrations and analogies in this deep dive, but I think one of the most powerful visuals is actually something that we see every single day.
What's that?
The sky. Think about it, the vastness of it, the ever-changing clouds, the way the sun rises and sets without fail, day after day.
It's a constant reminder that there's something much bigger than ourselves at work.
And that we're only a small part of that grand design.
I love that. It's such a simple yet profound image, and it's something that we can all relate to regardless of our background or beliefs.
So maybe the next time you're feeling overwhelmed by your plans or anxious about the future, just take a moment to look up at the sky. Let the vastness of it remind you that you're not in control.
And that's okay, because the one who is in control loves you more than you can possibly imagine.
And he has a plan for your life that is far greater than anything you could ever dream up on your own.
So surrender your plans, surrender your worries, surrender your doubts.
And trust that God is working all things together for your good.
Because he is. And that's the message of hope and freedom that we find in James 4:13-17.
It's a message that can transform our hearts, our minds, and our lives.
And it's a message that's worth sharing with the world.
So as you go back to your congregations, to your Bible studies, carry this message with you. Let it inspire you, challenge you, and encourage you.
And remember, you're not alone in this journey. We're all in this together. Walking by faith, trusting in the one who holds the future in his hands.
And that's the beauty of it all. The mystery, the surrender, the adventure of following a God who is always leading us, even when we can't see the way.
And that's where we'll leave you today. May you go forth with a renewed sense of purpose, a deeper trust in God's plan, and a heart that's ready to embrace the unexpected.
Because that's where the real adventure lies, in letting go of our own limited vision and stepping into the wide open spaces of God's grace.
And that's a journey worth taking.
Until next time, may you be blessed with wisdom, courage, and a deep abiding peace.
Amen to that.